So in this lesson, we're going to go ahead and work on split toning so we can learn what we can do with this particular feature of ACR. But before we get started on that, let's go ahead and create a new snapshot, and I'm going to call this HSL. All right, let's go ahead and head back to split toning, and let's talk about what we can do with split toning. So what exactly is split toning? Well, split toning allows you to split the tonal values of an image with specific colors of your choosing. So it gives you control over the tonal values in both the highlights and the shadows, which can provide you with some very cool artwork. So we have three different ways to make adjustments for our split toning, and that's via the highlights, the balance, and the shadow options here. So you may be wondering exactly how this works. Well, what happens is when you adjust the highlights or the shadows or both, what you're doing is you're introducing colors to the tonal range of that part of your image. So we can add colors to just the highlights, or we can introduce colors to just the shadows, or both. And you can also balance your colors in the highlights and shadows with your balance slider. And I'll show you how that works in just a second. So let's go ahead and work on our highlights first. And what we're going to do is we're going to change our colors in the highlights. So we're going to go ahead and move this to the right to start to change the colors. But the problem is nothing is happening. And that's because you need to increase the amount of saturation for those colors before it will start to appear. So once you adjust your saturation, you will then see the colors in the highlights to start to change. So right now I'm adding more blue because my hue slider is in that blue range. If I go back to the reds and oranges, you can see that the overall color of the sky is beginning to change colors, and that's because we're adding additional colors in the highlights at this point. So I can increase the amount of that saturation, or I can decrease it to my liking. And then we can do the same with the shadows. First, I would adjust the saturation, and then I would adjust the colors accordingly to what I'm trying to achieve. Now, one of the basic rules that I have for split toning is to make sure that my shadows and highlights are consistent in color. It just gives a more pleasing overall tone to my image versus doing something completely different. So if I change this to 22, and then I change the hue for the shadows to 32 as well, which I can actually type in, I get a more even color change in the highlights and the shadows, and it looks a little bit more natural versus doing something completely different like we did here. But again, that's entirely up to you. Rules are meant to be broken, and there's nothing that says you have to have both the highlights and the shadows equal to each other, and that's why it's called split toning, because sometimes you want different colors in your shadows versus your highlights. All right, let's talk about balance. So what does balance exactly do? Well, what it does is it splits between the highlights and the shadows. So adjusting the balance slider to the right will increase the amount of the hue in the shadows to increase. Moving the slider to the left will increase the adjustments in the highlights. So if you want one or the other to be more intense, then you can adjust the balance to be more prominent either in the highlights or the shadows, or if you keep it at 0, it's going to balance them out evenly. So for this particular image and this edit, what I want to do is remove the colors in the highlights, and I'm just going to introduce different colors in the shadows, and I'm going to change it to 25 and 25. So those are the settings that I like for this particular edit at this time. And what I'm going to do now is create a snapshot called split toning. And that's it. We are all set. Next up, we are going to learn about lens correction in the next lesson.